Hello wonderful people, it is Genevieve, and in this video we're going to learn how to draw a rock texture in a very easy way. And this video is part of a digital art course that is designed as a month-long YouTube series, so it is totally free. And you can definitely choose to only watch this one specific video if all you want is to learn how to draw rocks. But you can take on the challenge of improving our art skills by drawing along with the community every day. And if you want to do that, make sure to check out my website where the full schedule for the entire challenge is going to be. And also make sure to subscribe as well as ring the bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming textures that are going to be part of this course. So all you need for this tutorial is some sort of a digital art software, and I will be using Procreate on the iPad Pro. But you can definitely use pretty much anything that has layers in it. So Photoshop, Corel Painter, Krita, Affinity Designer. Honestly, most mainstream, and not even like that mainstream, digital art software will do for this tutorial. I will be suggesting just really basic digital art brushes, so basically the one that come with your software, they're definitely gonna work. And I will also include a free color palette in the description below, but otherwise you can pick your own colors if that's more what you're into. And if you are watching this video in the course, you also need to set aside, I would say, 15 to 30 minutes to really practice your rock texture depending on whether you are on day 6 or day 7 of the program. And with that being said, let's start drawing. So start by creating your canvas. The size is totally up to you. And if you've downloaded the color palette, make sure that you have it handy. And once you have the color palette, you're going to pick a neutral gray for your background, because that's a really good thing when you're practicing texture, to just have a very neutral background that is not totally black or totally white. And in the palettes, the 3 colors on the right are neutral gray. So pick the ones that you prefer. I'm going with the darkest one. And we are then going to create all over layers just so it's easier to draw. We don't have to create a bunch of layers and like it's already going to be done. So make sure that you're doing this step along with me, because it's going to make everything much easier in the end. So go ahead and start by creating a new layer that you're going to rename to Drop Shadows. And I quite like making this layer either in linear burn or multiply, and then lowering the opacity around 80%. You're then going to create another layer. This one you're going to rename it to Base and just leave it as a normal layer. You're then going to create a layer on top of this one, set it as a clipping mask, and change the name to Texture. Change the blending mode to linear burn as well, but this one you're going to lower the opacity around 25%. The next layer you're going to create is also going to be a clipping mask, and it's going to be renamed to Color. And you're going to change the blending mode of this one to Soft Light and leaving the opacity to 100%. The next layer is going to be for the extra, which I know the name doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but you'll see when we start drawing. This one, the blending mode is normal, and you're just going to lower the opacity around 30%, but we're going to go back later and tweak the opacity, so don't worry too much about that. Next layer is also a clipping mask. This one is going to be for the cracks, and this one is totally optional, so if you don't want to have cracks, just don't do this layer. The next one, also a clipping mask, is going to be renamed Grain. And for now, you can switch to blending mode or just lower the opacity. It doesn't really matter because we're going to play with it later in the tutorial. Next layer, I made a mistake here, which I'm going to correct later, is a clipping mask as well. It's going to be named Shadows, and you're going to set the blending mode to linear burn. And this is our last layer. This one is also a clipping mask. You are going to rename it to Light and set the blending mode to Overlay. For now, we're going to lower the opacity around 80%, but we're going to come back to it later. Great, so at this point, we're ready to start drawing. So go ahead and select your base layer as well as the top color. That's going to be the base color for the rock, basically. And I'm using the dry ink brush from Procreate, but seriously, the brush for this really does matter. You're then going to draw the shape or like the silhouette that you're going to use. If you're doing the program and you're on day 6 or the first day of rock, go ahead and draw just a circle. Otherwise, draw whichever object you're going to draw. Then you're going to select your texture layer as well as the light brown or light gray that is in the color palette, or any light brown or light gray. And you're going to try to find a brush that has a texture. Most digital art software has like charcoal brushes that look a bit like this. So just try to find something similar. So anything kind of like this. It could be airbrush, something that has some grit to it. And you're just going to really lightly brush it over your shape. Once you have your base texture, go to your color layer and go back to your favorite brush. So in my case, the dry ink brush, but again, this brush, not a big deal. You can just use whichever one you really like. And with the same color, you're just going to draw some little blobs kind of all over your shape. And I know the color layer name is a bit weird, but basically all we're doing at this point is we're just adding some color variation within the shape of the rock. And by doing that, we're also setting the groundwork for when we're gonna add some more texture and like a 3D-dimensional feel later. So basically all you're doing is just drawing some blobs all over your shape, and you want to make sure that it doesn't look like too regular of a pattern, that it's just a bit random. Once you have your blobs, we're going to add some light effects, or starting to add some light effects really easily. So you need to decide where your light source is. And this is, my light source is going to be on the top left, as you can see in the example. So go ahead and select your extra layer, as well as the dark gray brown color that we have in the color palette, or any darker color that you might want to use. And with your same favorite brush, you're just going to start adding some darker sections on your rock. And the way to do that is really easy. You're just going to imagine that your colored blobs are casting a shadow on the rock below it. So we're starting to add some depth to our rock, some textures and some like bumps and everything. And those color sections are basically the little bumps. So if your light source is, for example, on the top left like mine, the little bumps would cast a shadow on like below them, which would be on the right. So every bottom right section of your colored shapes would then become darker. If your light source is on the top right, it would be the opposite, so the bottom left. So basically, on the opposite side of your light source, you're always going to have your cast shadows. That's just universal truth. It's not just for rocks, it's always like this. Your cast shadow are the opposite of your light. So knowing that, just go all over your rock and add some darker spots, pretending that your colored sections are casting shadows. Great, so once you're satisfied with your shadow section, we're now going to add a little bit more light. So on the same extra layer, with the same brush, you're just going to pick a lighter version of your base color. And you're going to this time go over the colored section, so the top edge that is on the side where your light source is. So drop shadows are opposite, lights are obviously the same of the light source. So you're just going to go over your rock once more, but this time drawing the lights. One little pro tip as well, if your lights you find them to be a bit too rough, like you can see the sketching line, you can always use the smudge tool, which in most apps or software is going to be just like a finger icon, and really quickly go over your lines, and it's going to blend them in a little bit. You're still going to retain some of that really cool grit and cool texture, but it's not going to look as much as like a drawing as it did before. And I find for drawing rocks, or at least rock texture, it's really good to do a lot of back and forth. So as you're going to see me in this tutorial, and I'm going to encourage you to do that as well, just playing with the opacity of your layers. So obviously not the base layer. The base layer needs to remain 100% because rocks are not see-through. But all of the other layers, you can always just go back to them and increase or lower the opacity so that your texture blends in a bit more or a bit less. And that's going to allow you to just have something that is really up to your standards and just look the way you want it to look. And a good example of that is what you're going to see here. You're going to see me struggle a little bit with the opacity of the grain layer. So the next step is actually going to be to select the grain layer, and with the darker version of the gray-brown color that we have in the color palette, or whichever one you've been using, and the same brush, just adding some little dots. But as you can see here, the texture that, or the opacity that I had at first was just not dark enough. You just couldn't see the grain. So that's a really good example of going back in and tweaking everything. So in my case, I upped the opacity of this layer to 100, just to see what I was doing, but even later I'm going to change it again. So if you can see the grains that you're drawing, you don't have to change it. If you can't, feel free to up it as much as you need. And all you need to do at this step is sprinkle some little dots all over your rock to make it feel a bit more gritty and more rough. And you want to make sure that you don't have any strict patterns. So you don't want to have something that looks artificial. So you want to make sure that you really, really pay attention to just making sure your shape is organic. And so I know that sounds a bit crazy, but it's going to make a massive difference, and it's not as easy as it sounds. So the human brain is really tempted to just make things neat and organize everything into neat patterns. So you're gonna have to fight against your own brain and making sure that your little dots are scattered kind of randomly as much as possible. And once you're satisfied with your grain texture, you're going to go back to your opacity. Yes, of course. And you might even want to change the blending mode. So some rocks have like white speckles or paler speckles. Some rocks have really darker speckles. So honestly, at this point, there's absolutely no rule. I'm going to stay with normal, or actually I went with soft light and a lower opacity, but you can pick any blending mode that you want. So I don't know about you, but I think this texture is starting to look good, but it's just looking very, very, very flat. So go ahead, select a purple grayish color as well as your shadow layer, and with still your favorite brush, you're just going to draw the shadow that would be on your shape. So not the drop shadow, just really the shadow on your actual form. So if you're drawing a sphere, it's mostly going to be like a crescent moon shape. Again, on the opposite side of your light source. So if your light source is on the top left, it's going to be on the bottom right of your sphere. And one thing I like to do as well is draw just a slight line on the other side of the sphere. So basically, kind of like you're outlining the sphere. And then with your smudge tool, you're just going to blend in this edge, because we're not necessarily going for such a hard edge on our shadow. And when you blend or smudge, you're also going to blend and smudge this little top line that you've created as well. And it just makes the piece feel more coherent, and it just blends in the rock in the background a little bit more, but also helps make it pop from the background, which I know seems a bit contradictory, but it makes it feel more like one cohesive illustration. So if you're on day 6 of the course, the shadow is really easy. If you're on day 7, or if you're drawing something else, like you're not following the course, you're just drawing a rock, this step might be a bit more longer, because you actually have to think really about where your shadow is going to be. And once more, you can play with the opacity of the layer just to make sure that you have the intensity of a shadow that you want. And another thing that I really like to do is get my eraser and very, very, very gently erase a thin, super thin line to make kind of a light source from behind a rock, or like a reflection of light behind a rock. So you still get the feeling of your shadow, but you also get the feeling that the piece totally pops, and it adds a lot of realism, because you rarely have just one light source in nature. You get so many different lights. And speaking of lights, we're gonna add the famous light source that we've been talking about, or actually just showing the light source. So go on your light layer, and with the bright yellow banana color, just go ahead and draw a like oval on the top left of your shape, and then smudge it in. So rocks, unless they're very polished, and even then you would need some sort of varnish or whatever, they're not very shiny. So you do want to show the light, but it's definitely not going to be like a bright white color. It's going to be very soft, super blended, and you're barely going to see it. Great, so now we're at the step where we're going to add some cracks. And this step is obviously depending on which type of rock that you're drawing. If you want cracks, go ahead and pick the super dark gray that is in the color palette, so below the purple shadow color. And just go ahead and draw some like zigzag type of shapes on your rock. And you have to be mindful of two things. Rocks tend to break in fairly rigid patterns, so you would rarely get a curved break in a rock. However, you're probably thinking right now, Genevieve, you're saying you rarely break rocks in the curves. Why are you drawing a curve right now? Rocks also have a form. So you want to make sure that yes, your break or your cracks themselves are rigid and are like straight lines with straight edges, but they have to follow the shape and the form of your rock. So in my case, and in your case probably, we're drawing a sphere, so you have to follow the shape of your sphere with your cracks. So that's going to create some curves. So that might require some practice. I know drawing cracks seemed like a very easy thing to do, but it's probably the hardest thing to do in this entire tutorial because you really want to make sure that they follow the shape. Well, once you have something that you like, just go ahead and select a lighter version of your color. So you could just go back to the light color that we used when drawing the texture, or honestly, any bright color will definitely work. And you're going to outline the top section of the crack. So again, imagine your light source and imagine where the light would hit before the darkness of the crack. So it's probably going to be on the top, probably on the left. But again, you have to visualize that. That's a really helpful skill to develop, just knowing where your lights and your shadows are. Once you have your basic cracks laid out, you're going to, of course, play with opacity so you get something that feels a bit more realistic. And we're then going to select a very, very dark color, so something like black. And we're going to add a little bit of darkness in the sections where the crack either connects or separate. So you can see here, I'm just going in like the Y shape, just adding a little bit of black, and also where the crack kind of meets the edge of the rock. And that's going to help give this idea of depth in the cracks and not like they're just surface cracks. So depending on how deep you want them to be, you're going to play with adding more darkness or less darkness. And like I said in the beginning, this is really a texture that you want to do a lot of back and forth with to make sure that everything is coherent and everything works well together. In this case, we can see that with the cracks, some of the texture that we've drawn doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So feel free to go back to both your color layer and your extra layer and erase some of the parts, darken some other, and just really make sure that the shape and the texture are working hand in hand and not against each other. So at this stage, you can totally add a drop shadow if you want, so a cast shadow on the ground. That might help you situate your rock in the environment. Since we're drawing a sphere, or if you are drawing a sphere, it's really not necessary, but it's a cool touch that's going to make your piece look more finished. So if you want to do it, it's really easy. Go ahead and select your drop shadow layer as well as your grayish purple color and just draw an ellipse below or under your shape and then fill it in, or at least try to. You can see I'm struggling a little bit, but I got it. And then there are a few ways. So I'm going to show you one way in this tutorial and then another way in the next tutorial. So you can always use Gaussian blur. Gaussian blur is a very super like basic filter or like effect, so you should have it in pretty much any digital art software. In Procreate, well, you can see it, it's in the magic wand menu. In Photoshop, it's in the filter options, I think, so you can definitely find it. It's super easy, and so you just increase the Gaussian blur and it makes your cast shadow a bit softer. So there you go, this was how to draw a very basic but really good looking rock texture in any digital art software. And as you can see, depending on the effect that you want, you can create a lot of different rocks. So in my example that we have here, I chose to not have cracks but have deeper like craters almost in my rock. And that's a totally different feel, but it's the same technique. If you want to have cracks, I recommend not necessarily having super deep craters, because then they compete together. But so depending on what you put the emphasis on, you can get a wide range of different rock textures with this one strategy, this one technique. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up because it really does help the channel. And if you want to check out the rest of the digital art course, make sure to go and follow the link that will be in the description below. And if you are doing the entire course according to the schedule, make sure to come back to this video for day 7. So day 6 was drawing a rock in the shape of a sphere, but day 7 you kind of use the reference pictures that are on the website and also in the description. So make sure you come back to this video for day 7. And before you leave, don't forget to subscribe because I put out new videos like this one every week, especially during the month of January, where we're going to cover a total of 13 different textures spread across 5 teams. So make sure not to miss that, and I will see you soon.